If we take a market price, today's market price, I think it's somewhere between 3,300 and 3,400 as we're doing this show. Might be a little bit higher in a few days. That would release $750 billion, and I'll explain how if they were to revalue it. Now, there's several ways in which this can be done, and I'm also going to get to why 3,300, 3,400 is not the right number, why a higher number would be the appropriate one, the 15,000, which I talked about. But I just start with the basic principle that they go to the current market price of gold, and then we'll go from there as to why the higher number will be better.
Sounds good.
So there's broadly speaking, two ways in which this can be done. The first one was outlined in the Bitcoin bill, Bitcoin Act, which hasn't passed into law, but basically that act specified as a subclause of the act, the Federal Reserve would tender its gold certificates of $11 billion to the United States, in other words to the Treasury. The Treasury would then immediately revalue gold to the current price. In that Bitcoin Act, they referred to $3,300. Well, let's start with the price. Obviously, 15,000 was a number which I thought would be appropriate, but I've seen many arguments both for higher numbers and lower numbers, and I'll discuss how I got to a 15,000 level. But let's just go back a step and look at why it could be very beneficial to the United States to revalue gold. The United States is running record budget deficits. The debt is rising rapidly, and it is likely that the interest to be paid on that debt is going to rise very fast from here. We've seen the interest expense as a percentage of the receipts, the government receipts, i.e. the taxes it's taking in, rise from 3 years ago, just 8%. In other words, they were taking in taxes of, let's call it taxes of 100 and paying 8% in interest, and the rest was used for other government purposes, to this year, 18.6%. So it's more than doubled, certainly more than doubled in 3 years. Now, according to not only my calculations, but the Congressional Budget Office's calculations, that number is going to continue to rise for the foreseeable future. The only comment I'll make is the CBO is almost certainly being too conservative in their numbers, because they are assuming an interest rate which is unobtainable, i.e. far too low, unobtainable if you're a borrower at the moment. So the government has a large amount of debt maturing in the next 4 or 5 years. I think it's something like 9 trillion, which a lot of that debt was taken out when interest rates were 1 to 2%. And they're going to have to roll it over at higher rates, which are closer to, I'm going to say closer to 5%, although 4.2% wouldn't be an unreasonable rate at the moment.
Hidden in plain sight is a financial lifeline, America's vast gold reserves. Officially, the U.S. Treasury values its 261 million ounces of gold at just $42.22 per ounce, a relic of 1970s legislation. On paper, this places the total at a mere $11 billion. But at today's market price, above $2,400 per ounce, those reserves are worth over $600 billion. By revaluing gold to its true or even higher market price, the U.S. could unlock trillions in financial capacity without technically increasing its debt. This approach echoes past precedent, notably Franklin Roosevelt's bold gold revaluation in 1934.
That will cause the amount of interest being paid on the national debt as a percentage of the tax take to be actually worse than this 22.6% that the Congressional Budget Office sees for the year after next. And it's going to spiral up at quite a rapid pace beyond that. And there comes a point when it becomes completely unsustainable. So something has to be done to at least put the debt in check or reduce it or slow down. And I think one of the options, and by the way, this is not the only option, Daniela, but I think it's a very attractive one for the United States, would be to revalue gold at a higher level than the statutory price. Now, the statutory price for gold was set in, I think, originally was set when they raised it from $25 to $35 in 1934. And then I think they raised it again in 1972 and 1973 to now $42.22 an ounce. So the gold that the United States holds is on their books at a price of $42.22. And the Federal Reserve, who does not own the gold, but has a gold note representing the gold they did sell to the Treasury, a gold note which is worth $11 billion, priced at the original price of $42.22. Now, that gold note or gold certificate is not convertible into gold by the Federal Reserve. It just represents legal tender of $11 billion, even though it's called a gold certificate. Meanwhile, the Treasury's got the gold, which they've got on their books at $11 billion, but it's really worth $800 billion today.
The process is surprisingly straightforward. The Federal Reserve currently holds gold certificates from the Treasury valued at the outdated statutory price. If gold were revalued to, say, $3,300 per ounce, those certificates would instantly jump in worth. The Treasury could then demand the Federal Reserve pay the difference, hundreds of billions of dollars, without issuing new debt. This maneuver is not theoretical. It was executed successfully in the 1930s to stabilize government finances. Unlike Treasury bonds, these certificates are perpetual, carry no interest, and never mature, making them a unique financial tool for an overstretched government.
If we take a market price, today's market price, I think it's somewhere between 3,300 and 3,400 as we're doing this show. Might be a little bit higher in a few days. That would release $750 billion, and I'll explain how if they were to revalue it. Now, there's several ways in which this can be done, and I'm also going to get to why 3,300, 3,400 is not the right number, why a higher number would be the appropriate one, the 15,000, which I talked about. But I just start with the basic principle that they go to the current market price of gold, and then we'll go from there as to why the higher number will be better.
Sounds good.
So there's broadly speaking, two ways in which this can be done. The first one was outlined in the Bitcoin bill, Bitcoin Act, which hasn't passed into law, but basically that Act specified, as a subclause of the Act, the Federal Reserve would tender its gold certificates of $11 billion to the United States, in other words, to the Treasury. The Treasury would then immediately revalue gold to the current price. In that Bitcoin Act, they referred to $3,300.
Some analysts argue that simply updating gold to its market value is not enough. A higher revaluation, such as $15,000 per ounce, could generate nearly $4 trillion for the Treasury. While that doesn't erase the debt, it provides a powerful short-term reset, enough to slash deficits and retire a portion of maturing bonds. Crucially, this figure is modest compared to extreme proposals like $150,000 per ounce, which could destabilize global markets. At $15,000, the U.S. gains breathing room without triggering hyperinflationary fears, while reasserting gold's role as a cornerstone of financial credibility.
And then the Treasury would reissue to the Federal Reserve gold certificates identical to the previous ones, but at the current market value, which would be $700 or $800 billion, and the Federal Reserve would be obliged, on that happening, to pay to the Treasury the difference between the value of the two gold certificates. In other words, a bit more than $700 billion. Now, the beauty of this, and by the way, this has already happened effectively in 1934 anyway, so it's just a repetition of the same old trick, same old. Now, the beauty of this is that the gold certificates are not part of the national debt. In other words, when you see the national debt, that includes bonds issued by the government, notes issued by the government, treasury bills issued by the government, but it does not include the gold certificates. So, in swapping 11 billion of gold certificates for 750 billion of gold certificates, the Federal Reserve would have to pay to the Treasury the difference, $700 billion, without increasing the national debt. In fact, the Treasury gets the $700 billion, $750 billion, and it can use that money to reduce maturing debt, and obviously, because it's revalued the gold, it will show a huge profit, at least not as much to cover the budget deficit, which of $2 trillion, but it'll cover a third of the current year's deficit, bringing the deficit for the current year looking like it's not rising as fast as it really is. The gold certificates are effectively perpetual instruments, a bit like a banknote. They're perpetual, they're zero coupon, the government pays no interest on these gold certificates, and they can't be redeemed by the Federal Reserve, not for gold, not for cash, not for anything, unless the Treasury says so. So that would help a little bit if they did it at the current price of $3,300. But what I suggested was perhaps they should choose a different number, and I suggested the right number might be $15,000 an ounce.
Revaluing gold would not just be an accounting trick, it would reshape global finance. The U.S. could use this move to deter rivals like China and Russia, who have been aggressively adding to their gold reserves. By setting a high official gold price, Washington could make it costlier for foreign creditors to exit treasuries in favor of gold. Meanwhile, offering to buy gold at $15,000 per ounce could pull metal from global markets into U.S. reserves, strengthening America's monetary position while weakening competitors who depend on gold as a hedge against dollar dominance.
Well, exactly. A lot of people are saying, well, why not revalue gold at $150,000 an ounce and pay off the entire national debt? I think that's a dangerous strategy because it's going out a little bit too far into very untested territory. The figure I proposed of $15,000 would generate cash for the Treasury of $3.9 trillion. Now, that's not a terribly big number of cash relative to the national debt of $37 trillion. It's about 10% of the national debt. And it's not a terribly big number relative to the amount of increase in debt they have every year, which is around $2 trillion, slightly more. So it's a little bit adventurous. But the market can absorb that extra $3.9 trillion with no problem at all. I mean, after all, $3.9 trillion is smaller than the size of Microsoft. It's smaller than the size of Nvidia. It's smaller than the size of several companies on Wall Street. So that would be $3.9 trillion of new cash coming into the Treasury's hands, which would allow the Treasury the ability to retire some of the debt which is maturing this year and next year, and show not a deficit for the current year, because the deficit is going to be $2 trillion roughly, but it will show a profit of $1.9 trillion on its budget for the current year. And it would bring the debt down to the level of where it was a year or two ago as well. Now, of course, this is only temporary respite. It's not a permanent solution. It's kicking the can down the road.
While bold, a gold revaluation would not permanently solve America's debt crisis. The underlying issue remains: the U.S. spends far more than it collects. A $15,000 gold price might buy a few years of relief, but without fiscal reform, deficits would quickly consume the gains. Still, history shows governments often reach for unconventional solutions when pushed to the brink. With rising interest costs, shaky bond markets, and a growing distrust in fiat currencies, the idea of unlocking hidden value from America's gold is no longer far-fetched. It could be the reset Washington eventually turns to.
The Oval Office decorated with all kinds of golden things these days. But the reason for thinking this might happen was the original comment a few days after Scott Bessent became Secretary of the Treasury, in which he said, "We plan to monetize the US balance sheet for the benefit of the American people." Now, the one liquid and undervalued asset they've got, or the most undervalued, most liquid asset they've got, is the gold. So it's a reasonable assumption that at the time he said that, he was thinking of the US government's gold.
Now again, let's play out the 15,000 scenario. People are going to say, well, then who would buy my gold?
Exactly. Well, the brilliant thing here is if the Treasury does this, to make it plausible, they should stand buyer of last resort of all the gold that's coming to them at $15,000 an ounce. Now that would be a brilliant move by the Treasury, because one, it's going to get a lot of gold that it wants in exchange for worthless paper, which you can print ad infinitum, via the Federal Reserve by just repeating the trick over and over again. So it's going to get a lot of gold onto its books. It's going to mess up America's enemies, if you say, and I don't mean enemies in the bad way. I mean the sort of financial enemies, the ones who are saying, we want to convert our Treasury bonds, our Treasury bills, because we don't really trust them. We want to convert them into gold. And we see that ongoing a little bit here and there, and it could turn into a rush. But if they push the price of gold that much higher, it's going to become that much more difficult or that much more expensive for those foreign holders of Treasury bonds and bills to convert them into gold, or at least to get as much gold as they were getting at the old price. So in a way, it's mess with your enemies a little bit by putting the gold price at $15,000.